or if you were very stressed out, or you were wearing like music, or you couldn't like possibly understand what was going on in that situation, we think that that can be talked about in a court of law. We think that that can be used as mitigating factors. So for example, if you are like under drugs or substances when a crime is committed, we would consider that a mitigating factor, or somewhere you can get like lower sentences, or like things like crimes of passion. Those are all mitigating factors that exist in the status quo that we consider, and we make sure that people know that that exists, so that we don't like charge everyone the same amount. But also note here that it's really unclear if they would give somebody like who committed a crime of passion the same sentence as somebody who committed like premeditated murder, just because it's hard to prove. Just because something's hard to prove doesn't mean that you like ignore the entire sentence completely. So we think that saying it's hard to prove is not enough. And we think that even in the most cases, we think that like even if in the most cases people are likely to help, we want to deal with the cases where people aren't helping. This is what this debate is about, and this is why we've already won that on the fringe cases that they want to talk about. But second of all, is this actually a crime? Note here that they literally have not dealt with my first speaker's argumentation at all. So I'm just going to have to rebuild this and reiterate it. What they've tried to talk about is fringe cases about like iPhones in Africa and charity. Four main responses to this. First of all, we tell you, you can like possibly weigh things up, right? Like when you are like just when you commit a murder, you can weigh things up. Like, is your selfishness like necessary for you to commit a crime? You like plan things out and you weigh things intentionally. When you're taking a walk, or when you're going on your way to walk, to work, and you see somebody suffering by you, or you see a baby drowning, we think that you can weigh up, should I help somebody or should I continue on my way to work? We think that the intention exists. But we tell you that second of all, even if the intention doesn't exist, even if people did not intentionally commit this crime, we have things like like we charge the people for things like manslaughter or unintentional crimes, because we think that the effect of that crime is really large scale and we should still consider it. But thirdly, we think that we have like a mechanism for doing good anyway in your side of the house. Like we like charge billionaires taxes, or charge people in the West taxes, so that we can redistribute those taxes and do good with it. We think that the state can infringe to a certain degree in that situation. But like lastly, we think that this is going to be practically beneficial. So all the argumentation about how it's hard to prove, or that people like aren't going to do this, or you're gonna like charge people who are innocent, we think that when you implement this, people are going to be more conscious and make sure that they're always making sure that they're making an active effort to help humanity and help people. We think that inaction causes massive harms. If somebody dies because you decided to block your ears and walk the other way, if somebody dies because you had negligence through drunk driving, we think that you should be charged as a criminal, because you are a criminal in that situation. Now that we understand what this debate is actually about, I'm going to go into my argumentation, but before that, I'll take a POI.
Again, let's notice, by proposition is throwing everyone who chooses to have some amenities, as opposed to giving this money to solve immediate hunger and save people's lives in prison. The reason that this is an inviable solution is because you are simply incriminating everyone.
No, okay. Contradiction. First of all, you firstly say that everybody is nice and will help, and now you're saying that we're going to incarcerate everybody. That doesn't make sense. But second of all, we tell you we're not incarcerating everyone. We're just simply forcing people to make more conscious decisions and inflicting morality in a way that makes sure that people care about other people, to make sure that they're not walking past a drowning baby and letting it drown. That is what we're doing in this debate. We're not just simply like redistributing resources in weird ways that they talk about. So now let's move on to my argumentation about how we essentially dictate and change morality on what it is ought to look like, and not what it is currently looking like inside opposition's world. So important to note is that the law doesn't just exist as a deterrent, or it doesn't just exist to punish people. We think that like the law exists to make sure that they don't just want to punish people who commit crimes, but ingrain it into them that doing so is an immoral action and should not take place, right? The state is a mechanism in which morality is dictated into us and conveyed into us. So for example, when the state implements like protection for sex workers, they aren't just doing that to protect sex workers, they're doing that to say that sex work is a valuable thing, and that has a trickle-down effect into society. Or when you have workplace discrimination laws against for women, you don't just say that it's not just for those laws, it's to show that society that women are equal and should be regarded as such. But that can also work conversely, right? So when you like stop Black people from voting, we think that portrays a moral value that says that these individuals are less valuable, and that has social repercussions to it. So we say that trickle-down effect exists. But second of all, we think that laws also reflect morality and values changing, right? So for example, the legalization of gay marriage in America, like, represented that moral value of society progressing and changing, and therefore the law had to adapt to that. Now we say that we are moving towards a society that values complacency and complicity way, way less, and does not tolerate that at all. So with like movements like Black Lives Matter that use like slogans like silence is violence, and if you like, society is no longer willing to accept the fact that you are a bystander, or you're not calling out your family and friends when they're doing something racist. We think that you shift, like, which shows a collective value and a shift to what is or what isn't accepted in society today. And we think that the laws not only ought to reflect that, but we think that the law should reflect that. On our side, we tell you what happens is, like, on a principle level, we say that we shift morality to, one, adapt to society's morality changing, but second of all, change those who have not adapted yet, because we think that complicity is an atrocity and should be regarded as such. So to start valuing things more than themselves, we think that some of the biggest problems have been caused from like selfishness and a lack of care for other individuals. We think that that has been one of the biggest issues in society. So things like not valuing refugees, or walking past somebody and not helping them. We think that all of these things are a shift in morality and a trickle-down effect when we implement this policy. Because now the government is saying that your work on your selfishness to disregard somebody else is immoral and unjustifiable. We cannot be prouder to propose this debate. Thank you.
Cool. I thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Can I check if the panelists are ready?
Yeah.
Cool. Looks good. In which case, I would like to call up the second opposition speaker to continue the case for their side, and encourage Tim Israel to potentially switch off their cameras themselves.
Is that okay?
I think it is in this case. Yeah.
Okay, but not now. Hagar is going to be speaking with the camera on, I assume.
I think that the reason why we should do that is to avoid internet connection issues, and that applies to this specific speech as well.
Okay, so you prefer that I speak with the camera off?
Potentially to avoid internet connection issues, but if you don't feel comfortable without a camera, then feel free to do it with a camera.
Okay, so we're going to turn off our camera then.
I'm going to start in...
If it's okay, we prefer the camera on. If there's any specific problems, just tell us and we'll turn the camera off later on. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Great, thanks.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there's a massive logical fallacy inside Proposition's case, and specifically when they don't engage with the fact that their criteria is going to be putting so many people in prison, people who we don't think deserve to be imprisoned, and we give you the exact mechanisms as to why we don't think that is justified. I'm going to have quite a bit of rebuttal before moving into my point about how less people are going to act on their side of the house or the good. Either way, I'm going to show you why either group of people is going to be making the situation worse than it would have been. Let's begin with rebuttal. Look, here's what we tell you from the start, and we think this is a nuanced side Proposition needs to engage with. We think that in the status quo, they don't have delta in the massive cases they're describing, right? The fact that if I see my friend being raped, or I hear something like specifically very scary, or I have medical knowledge and I know I can intervene and help. We think that the people they are describing, the people they are talking about, usually do intervene to some extent in the status quo. We think that if you are calm and rational in that situation, if you know what to do medically, if you know what to do in other cases, we think that you will intervene. That is exactly what we tell you. Where do we think is the problem? This means that the delta that they have in these cases is incredibly rare, but we're also going to show you why specifically in these cases we're going to be making the situation actively worse. Why is that the case? Note the lack of engagement of our first speaker's points, right? When we specifically tell you that when you don't know the exact threshold as to which you're going to be held accountable for. So for example, when you see someone choking and you don't know whether or to which degree you should intervene or how you should intervene, you don't know if it is your moral obligation in this case or your legal obligation to call an ambulance or whether it is your obligation to start doing the Heimlich maneuver. We think that at that point, people are likely to be the people who are going to act are likely to be doing more harm than good. Why? Because when you're nervous and when you don't know if you're going to be held accountable for the fact that you did call an ambulance, but you didn't do everything you possibly could have and you didn't try to do everything you could to save their lives, that is the point at which you're going to be making things worse. That is the point at which you're going to be trying to do Heimlich, although you only learned how to do it in high school and you don't exactly remember how to do it, and you're going to cause that person to choke to death when otherwise the ambulance would have arrived and they wouldn't have died, right? We think that the point at which they're making people who would have intervened, they're making them nervous, they're making them not sure about whether or not they're going to be imprisoned, they're making them not sure as to whether or not they're going to be held accountable for this crime. At that point, we think that they're going to be causing way more harm than good, and people are going to be intervening when they shouldn't. But note specifically the lack of engagement in the question of, is this an immediate danger or not? Because they don't respond to the very clear criteria we give you on why people usually know that there are dying children in Africa that if they would have chosen not to upgrade their iPhone to and give that $1,000 to charity, it would have directly saved their lives. We don't accept that there's a difference here in the case of, is it going to directly save lives either way? We think in both cases, people know it's going to directly save lives. They don't engage with that nuance and the fact that they're basically going to be putting a lot of people culpable, a lot of people in prison. Let's then talk about the things that they try to make out of this debate, like stress, or as describing it as a mitigating factor. The example of drugs they give us is not enough. Why? Because most people aren't on drugs, and there's usually you can do blood tests to discover whether or not someone was on drugs, right? You can't do that in stress. You can't do that in shock. You can't do that and specifically find out which are the type of people who were shocked in that sense, who had a fight or flight response, who were specifically shocked to the extent that prevented them from intervening, right? Why is this important? Because it means that we think that if that is their mitigating circumstances, we think everybody is going to be telling the jury or the judge that they were stressed, and a lot of these people are going to be right, and a lot of these people would have actually been stressed under that situation and would have actually had a biological response panel that would have prevented them from intervening. At that point, they cannot make it out and say, well, we'll listen to people and we'll try to figure out unto what extent of stress they were, because if they do that, they're not going to be incriminating anyone, right? Because anybody can say that they're stressed because it's incredibly hard to measure, and it's something that they don't engage with, and we give you from the start. At that point, they have to accept that they're going to be putting people in prison. They're going to be incriminating people that didn't deserve it, that it wasn't a reasonable expectation of us to expect them at that time, that we don't know to what extent they were shocked, to what extent it was a flight or fight response. At this point, panel, when on either side of the comparative, they're not engaging with the fact that they're going to be holding a massive amount of people accountable that didn't deserve to be held accountable, we think that they lose the debate on that.
POI?
Given that, let's move into our third point on what are the different groups of actions are bad either way. He would have intervened anyway, and on their side of the house are going to intervene more because they don't know exactly which threshold they're going to be held accountable for, so they're not going to just call the ambulance, they're going to try and do Heimlich and kill that person. What is the other group of people? The other group of people is the people who initially had a fight or flight response, the people who initially froze, they heard a scream somewhere down the street, and they didn't know what to do. And they took 5 minutes, 10 minutes to think about it, they ran away, and they were stressed. After those 5 minutes, panel, we think that a lot of people in the status quo are going to get a hold of themselves and call the police, or at least try to track over the case and see if they can come and testify. On their side of the house, panel, people are not going to be doing this. After they had calmed down from their initial fight or flight reaction, and they're going to be away from that situation, they're going to think to themselves, my God, I'm going to be held accountable, I'm going to be sued, I can end up in jail. So that's the point at which the self-protectionism they want to talk about becomes significantly worse. On our side of the house, these people would have come and testified in court. On our side of the house, these people would have called the police a few minutes later. On their side of the house, they're not going to be doing that. Before I continue, I'll take a point of information.
Would you hold someone criminally liable if they don't intervene and they weren't in shock? In those cases, would you forward our policy?
We think that there's just no way to tell. And we think that you have to accept that that there are way more people that are in shock and you're going to be incriminating than people who are not. So at that point, we think that you're just doing way more harm than good. And at that point, we think that just like by weighing of the harms versus benefits here, we think you lose massively on that. What do we tell you at the end of the day? We tell you that on either way, reactions of people are going to be worse. Either people who would have intervened and now are intervening to the extent they're making the situation worse, or people who would have taken a few minutes to run away, calm down because blood triggers them because they don't know what to do when they hear screams, and they would have called the police a few minutes later, but on their side panel, they're not going to do so because they're afraid of ending up in prison. At that point, we show you why on either way, people are going to be acting worse on their side of the house. We show you why people do not deserve to be held accountable in the majority of cases. And for all of these reasons, we win the debate. I beg you to oppose.
Cool. I thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Are the panelists ready? That's a yes, that's a yes. Easy. Yeah, cool. In which case, I would like to call up the third proposition speaker. Here.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. Start then. Silence is violence. Your implicit acceptance of a system that oppresses people is something we principally think you should oppose. But we don't think that the state pursues criminal liability because we understand that your right to freedom of expression is large enough to override that burden. This debate is in cases where we say very clearly, we're not pressuring you to do something that is so intense and so hard to do that it violates your human rights. We're not forcing you to donate an organ. And secondly, it is very clear that the danger that's present to you is not one of extreme severity. This is the world that we have to engage with, and whether we think principally these individuals should be held accountable. Before I go on to my main two clashes of is government legitimate in holding criminally liable these individuals, and secondly, will pressure to create help actually benefit these victims, let's do some context clarity. First thing, we tell you that state infringes on individuals' rights for societal benefit all the time. We showed you that from our first speaker. Their main responses that I'll get onto later is that, well, would you take away individuals' ability to buy things? The problem with that is they haven't engaged on the spectrum. They haven't showed us what we've shown you, which is about how much pressure is put onto you relevant to how much of an outcome we create. That's what we're going to win this debate on. Secondly, they tell us our policy of taking into account mental states like shock and the ability to your ability to help is unreasonable because it's hard to prove. First things here. Firstly, we take these things into account into other crimes, right? That's the role of the judicial body, is to be able to decide when these things are enough of a factor and when these things do exist, right? We take into account crimes of passion. We take into account pleas of insanity or pleas of ignorance, right? We say that this court system is set up to be able to work out when these things exist and when they exist to a significant degree. But even if we concede that we're unable to judge when this happens and everyone's going to plead that they were in shock, then our worst case is that we don't hold anyone accountable, in which all of their harms of holding people accountable who didn't do anything fall, and we still have the principal legitimacy of saying that we say that rape is illegal even if it's hard to prosecute. We win on that side, on that unreasonable wall. But thirdly, we tell you, what do these cases realistically look like? We tell you, there's two ones. Your uncontroversial examples, when it's very clear that you can help, like someone drowning in the water, or you hearing someone being being attacked and there's very little danger to you, you can just call the police. They say in these cases it's not important because people act. The entirety of the bystander apathy is based off of cases where individuals heard someone being attacked in broad daylight and did nothing because there was no incentive and they felt like someone else was going to do it. They haven't engaged with our narrative of how we provide an incentive in these cases. But let's talk about the second option, the controversial cases, right, where there are significant dangers to you. Firstly, we don't think that the extreme ones are in this motion, because if it's extreme that like it's a falling building in 9/11, we wouldn't expect you to help because there's a reasonable danger there. But let's talk about the ones that are reasonable, where there is some level of reason you wouldn't engage, like a social stigma or the fear that you will be isolated, or maybe some economic loss of like the suit that you're wearing, you don't want to jump into the river. We're going to tell you why in these cases we think it's reasonable to pressure individuals to pursue this change. So let's get on. So firstly, finally, before I get on to my classes, what are the metrics we're going to weigh up in this? Benefit to vulnerable individuals, and they are the most vulnerable and the people we should help. And secondly, whether the state has this obligation and to principally pursue holding these things criminally liable. Let me go on to my first clash. After this, I'll take a POI. First clash, is the government legitimate in holding these individuals accountable? Here are the arguments they brought to us. A, that the outcomes isn't enough of a reason to hold people accountable, because if you buy a phone instead of donating to charity, we wouldn't criminalize you. What is the difference here? A, we have mechanisms already that use your wealth for societal benefit, e.g. tax. We don't take all of your wealth away, since we understand you have some of right to engage with it, but we're willing to take some level of it away. It's the same here. We wouldn't force you to do the best thing in every scenario, but we'd force you to do a reasonable amount of good and a reasonable amount of engagement when the barrier to entry is so low, because there's no danger to you. It's why we have manslaughter, which doesn't have intent to harm, right? We think this is very clear. The difference here, besides giving an iPhone, is that A, we're not forcing you to do so much. We're not going to take entire control of your economic spending, right? Since that would be a huge violation. We don't think it's a violation to say you need to call the police, or you need to go to someone who's like dying and ask them if they are okay and pursue a reasonable amount of change, right? We're not violating human rights. That's where the difference comes into play. There is not an extreme pressure we're putting on you. We're not forcing you to spend all your money. That's important because we showed you that we had other options besides outcome of why you had a principal obligation, like Ivan's argument about being an actor of the state because of the benefits they give you, and having a principal obligation to hold their duty of benefiting society. So second argument, since I dealt with that, they say that the choice isn't valid because of shock and because you don't know how to help in a majority of cases. A, we take emotions into account in a variety of individuals and we're able to take them into account here. But secondly, the reason we say emotions are mitigating but not take away all guilt, because trans panic, the fear at someone who's trans because you didn't expect them to be, was an excuse for decades in the legal system that excused actions taken against and killings taken against trans individuals. That was a true emotion that these individuals felt. We don't think it was enough for the harms that they pursued. We think you are responsible for the emotions you feel to a degree, and we're willing to hold you accountable like we do before. We tell you any action is enough to a degree. We're not holding you unrealistically accountable. We just want you to call the police. We made that clear. We want you to make a reasonable amount of help that doesn't put you in danger. They haven't engaged with this realistic case, right? So now that I've shown you that we think government is principally legitimate in pursuing these things, this is not an extreme burden that they put on you, and you have an obligation to societal benefit, I'll take a POI before I move on.
When you see someone bleeding on the street, people react instinctively. People run away. People are afraid. This is a biological reaction that you can't just say people need to
deal with this biological reaction. But in realistic circumstances, we don't think individuals always do this. We don't think it's such an overriding fight or flight reaction. We think a lot of the time it's just apathy. They just don't care enough. They think it's someone else's problem. We think this is a more realistic interpretation. In cases where you can prove such an extreme amount of emotion that you had no choice in the matter, we think that's going to be reasonably easy to prove to the courts because it was so extreme. It's the cases where it's less extreme, where you had more of a choice, but you felt that it wasn't enough to see the other person's life as valuable to make that choice. That's what we're going to engage in. But let's engage with that clash then. Is it beneficial for us to pressure individuals to act? First thing they brought to us, because they brought three things. A, individuals would be unable to help because not all of them are good swimmers, right? We tell you there was a range of actions we provided in our first speech that are very reasonable for individuals to undertake. Calling for help from charities or state actors. Engaging in making a plan with the individuals that surround you that can best help that person. We think this debate is about no action. It's about doing nothing to help these individuals. That's the barrier to entry that we provided. That's all individuals have to cross above of, right? Secondly, they tell us individuals trying to help will get harmed. Firstly, only in the most extreme circumstances. We told you if there is a reasonable fear of harm, right, and it's not unreasonable for you to say, I think I could have been hurt, then we're willing to say that you didn't have an obligation that way because that's a violation of your human rights to put yourself in danger. We don't think the state can force you to do that. But secondly, even if we take them at their best and say, yes, some individuals will be harmed in some cases because sometimes they're wrong and don't expect the harm, but it is prevalent, we're willing to make that sacrifice, right? We're willing to say in some small amount of circumstances, you'll be harmed because the benefit of actively helping individuals who we know in the motion are in extreme danger, doing the minimum thing to help them and saving their lives is vastly overweighing their harms that they brought to us. Final thing they said, that individuals will cause harm because they're scared of prosecution. So like, A, they're going to be more extreme and try the Heimlich maneuver when they don't do it, or B, they're not going to testify in the future. Firstly, we can subpoena them to testify if it's so necessary, but we're not only talking about crimes that they have to testify for. We're talking about individuals who just slipped and broken their back that you have to help. We tell individuals don't actively, can be reasonable in these circumstances, such an overpowering emotion. But secondly, even if they do, the Heimlich maneuver usually isn't that dangerous. The help that they will attempt to do in the majority of cases are going to be beneficial rather than harmful. Engage with our second speaker's matter about how we change societal focus to the well-being of the whole instead of the well-being of the individual. If you want to create a good world, individuals have to value everyone else the same as they value themselves. That's what Proposition's been telling you this entire debate. That's all you have to believe in to vote for us.
Cool. I thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Can I ask if the panelists are ready? Yep. Cool. In which case, I would like to call up the third opposition speaker. Here.
The reason that Side's proposition mechanism is impossible, panel, is because they're holding everyone accountable to a very, very, very high and even impossible level of morality. And this is going to directly lead to all of these individuals being thrown in prison, or even if they're not thrown in prison, having crippling fines imposed upon them. This is incredibly important to understand, because we believe that had they have done good distinctions, which were clear as to why not every individual who pays for amnesties, which he likes, which I don't necessarily help his life, but instead of giving this money away to charity, which will directly save lives, if they don't explain to you why these individuals are not going to be held accountable on their side of the house, we just assume that they are. At this point, the reason that their mech is just impossible is because by throwing all of these people in prison, they hold the entire population accountable to an impossible level of morality. This is a logical fallacy on their side of the house. This is a burden which they didn't prove, and this is what is going to lose them this debate. But other than that, two questions. The first is practical outcomes, and the second is whether or not these individuals are morally accountable. So, but beforehand, two pieces of extraneous rebuttal. The first thing they tell us is about the last thing they tell us in the second speaker regarding we're changing the message that people get and we're making people more moral in the long term. Largely, we believe that there are many substitute mechanisms of doing this, right? We believe that if we would say put a larger emphasis on this in schools, make sure that kids from a very young age are grown up with these prospects, we believe that in the long term this would have changed just as likely on their side of the house. We're not sure why you actively need to throw their parents in prison in order to prove this to them. They don't analyze this, and this hardly stands. But the second thing, let's double down on the thing which they simply don't fulfill their burden, right? Because they tell us explicitly that they don't prefer a world in which they're throwing everyone in prison for these amnesties. They say that the reason that we're not throwing people who bought an iPhone 5 into prison is because they couldn't recognize that there was a direct danger, and because we believe that this wasn't a legitimate request that the government would have of them, plus the fact that we have taxes. Let's engage with these three responses, explain why these distinctions aren't enough, and why essentially what they're doing is throwing everyone in prison and therefore lose the debate. Even if not throwing everyone in prison, holding people morally accountable and legally accountable to a moral standard which no one is going to stand up to. So firstly, regarding immediacy and recognizable, people are actively dying on a daily basis from hunger around the world. People dying on a daily basis from malaria. It would be very easy to solve these things using two mechanisms. A, giving people malaria nets. B, making sure that people have malaria injections available. We say people recognize and know that there are charities who do this and there are charities who are directed at this. People just choose not to give their money in the status quo. According to side properties, and it's not illegitimate to ask these people to give some more of their money rather than paying for amnesties. Yes, we have taxes and we take some of their money. According to side proposition, we should take all of their money, and if they don't give all their money to charity, then we should be throwing them in prison. This is just a logical fallacy on their side of the house, which is lost on the debate at this point in time. But beforehand, let's quickly show why this is in contender with our first point. We say when it is immediate, when you can see someone suffering, then the likelihood of you actually helping him is significantly larger. On the other hand, even if someone is immediately dying elsewhere, but it's just very hard for you and he happens to be from a different ethnicity, then yes, apathy happens. On their side of the house, apathy doesn't happen. In cases which they want to talk about, apathy doesn't happen. On our side of the house, it does happen. It seems that they just lose the debate on that burden alone. But let's talk about practical impacts. No, because they put all their eggs in this basket when they say that the most important thing in this debate are practical impacts, and regardless of whether or not the question of culpability, the state has got the obligation to take care of its citizens. Notice how the moment that they do so, they lose the debate. When they don't engage with about 8 minutes of analysis in my former speakers as to why, even if you're pushing more people to action, this is in many cases a bad thing. And here let's reiterate what we told you. We tell you that most individuals who are untrained are going to be actively harmful in these circumstances, right? Because in most cases, they're not going to know that it's enough just to call, right? Because it's unlikely to be a clear one-sided law, because there are going to be 100,000 different cases where individuals are in danger, and you can't have a single law. Oh, in all of these cases, it's enough for you to call. Consequently, we believe that the law is likely to be vague. And even if the law isn't so vague, we believe that the average person on the ground doesn't necessarily know what the law is. This means that even if it would have been enough for him legally just to call up, he doesn't know this at the point of time where he needs to make the decision. Also, we say that even if he recognizes, which in many cases he might not, but even if he recognizes that by hoping he might be doing more harm than good, it's still a rational decision according to side propositions analysis for him to make this decision. Why? Because he knows that even if he did more harm than good, but he can prove that he was trying to help, then he won't be held accountable. On the other hand of the house, if there's a massive question of whether or not he didn't do enough, whether or not calling wasn't enough and there was more that he could do, he can be held accountable. At this point, we get many people doing procedures which they don't know how to do, which actively harm people and which cause people death in many cases, specifically regarding things like structures collapsing, and whether or not we've got many people just clashing the scene and trying to save people, in many cases killing them for this, whether it's medical procedures which people simply don't know how to do but believe that they know how to do because they've seen it on TV and put people in danger as a consequence of that. We believe that the world is worse outside of the house. The moment that they don't engage with this, they lost the debate. But let's engage with their side of the house on this issue, right? But they tell us, oh, a majority of people are just going to call, and that their main impact is that tomorrow people call and report instances. Notice that this is the only clarified impact which they give us. We just believe that there's very little impact on this side of the house, right? Because we say, people in many cases calling the status quo and saying, oh, bystander effects happened is not enough to win this clash. Because we say, yes, bystander effects happen. According to your side of house, by just teaching people that bystander effect is something which is not okay, we can solve this. So let's just do all the relevant campaigns in order to make sure that we do so. B, bystander effect does happen, is just incredibly rare. That's why the very few cases where we actually hear about it are where it actually happens, we hear about it so much. And this is important to understand. We believe that the majority of people are not going to ignore someone in pain, even if it would be better for them economically, because you've just got an emotional reaction to see someone in pain and if you want to help them. So meaning that the impacts in this debate are very low. Maybe some more people report some more crimes and make the call. On our side of the house, we've got many more people getting involved in issues which they don't know how to solve and making the situation actively worse for the security services who might otherwise solve this question. Second of all, notice how we tell you that in many cases, people are getting less involved on their side of the house. Why? Because people know that in many cases they can't be held accountable at the point which the crime happened, because no one saw them leaving the scene where a woman was raped, because no one saw them not helping the person who was currently choking, right? At this point, we say 5 minutes later, at the point which they've already left, in our side of the house, they make a call and then they just give the ambulance there, because they know that even if they were 5 minutes late, they can't be held morally accountable for this. On their side of the house, they don't, and they don't testify about it later if it was a crime, so we never end up holding the criminals accountable and stopping these criminals from criming again, right? Because they have massive negative practical impacts on their side of the house. According to their own metrics, this is enough for the team who wins this to win the debate. And because they're not responsive to the many different reasons which they give to this, they simply won this debate, lost this debate. This
we can have very reasonable requirements that are outlined in the law for what you should do besides the high individual's responsibility to know the law. It's not a reason for
Let's go into the second part of this speech, right? Okay, I didn't get that. Maybe it's because our internet is unstable. Sorry, it was something about moral culpability. We're getting into that now. But notice, according to your own point, what's more important is whether or not there are practical benefits, whether or not we're saving lives, we're saving our lives on our side of the house. Let's still discuss culpability. Because what do we tell you? We tell you that many people, even if they're not in a state of medical shock, which can be medically proven later on, are in a place where they believe that there's a direct danger to their lives. Why? Because there's chaos all around them, because buildings are collapsing and people are choking, right? This is something which in many cases averts people from action and making people believe that there's more danger to them than there actually was. What does this mean? Because by proposition, and this is important, believes that you're not allowed to hold someone legally accountable in cases where there was a risk to his life. We're not sure why it matters if that risk was real or if that risk was just something which he believed was there. Why is this important to understand? Because side proposition's legitimacy is based on the fact that this was a reasonable expectation. We say it's not a reasonable expectation to expect someone to do a decision and to save someone's life if he believes that he's putting himself in danger. They didn't engage with this nuance and they can't even win the culpability. For these reasons,
if that was a question on audibility, it did cut off a couple of times, but it wasn't major. We got the majority of the speech. So I thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Let me just check if the panelists are ready to move to replies. Sorry. Let's say yeah, let's say yeah, let's say yeah. Easy.
Sorry, I was on mute, yes.
Okay, cool. In which case, we're now going to move to the reply speeches, starting off with the opposition reply. Here.
May I begin?
Yes.
On absolute best case, they help solve the bystander effect in a few more people. They help make sure that a few people who might have been apathetic otherwise would call the police, and that is what they're solving. What is our answer to this, and why do we think this is just going to be the minority of cases, and even if they achieve that, the likelihood of someone being sued for apathy is much lower than the likelihood of someone being sued unjustly because they were stressed, because they couldn't have been expected to come. I'm going to talk about this weighing of likelihood and then the weighing of whether or not, even if we get more action, whether or not this action on the grand scheme of things does more harm than it does good. Let's start with the first part, likelihood. We tell you from the get-go, we think most people don't fall under the criteria side proposition want to discuss. Most people aren't that apathetic when they hear someone screaming. What do people do in these cases? Most of the time, they are going to stop by. Most of the time, if they see someone hurt, they are going to do the minimum they can if they don't feel like they're in danger, right? If that is the cases they want to describe, we think in the vast majority of cases, people aren't just going to walk by when they see someone bleeding if they know that they can help, if they have the mental clarity to do so at the moment. But we tell you more than that. We tell you that the people who are apathetic are going to be way worse on their side of the house, right? Because if you didn't stop, if you were apathetic in the first 5 minutes and you walk away and then you think to yourself, wait, but maybe I should have called the police. Maybe I should have done something. If you think about this after the fact, the likelihood of you doing something under their side of the house, which is an absolute zero, while on our side of the house, at least there's a chance. At least afterwards and saying, okay, maybe I should have done something. But regardless, we tell you this is just the minority of cases. What is the majority of cases then? We tell you that people that inherently from their metric, the only metric proposition have defined in this debate and can reasonably define given the things that they give us, is that judges will find you guilty even if you thought you were in danger at the moment. even if it wasn't a reasonable expectation for us to expect of you to try to understand and figure out what to do at the moment. Why is this the case? Because we think that the court cannot distinguish between people who thought they were in danger and people who didn't actually think they were in danger and are actually apathetic and lying, etc. Right? Why? Because we think that everyone is going to claim they were in danger. Everyone is going to claim they thought and they felt nervous and they froze and they didn't know what to do. We think that for a lot of people, it is also actually going to be the case, but the court is not going to accept this for everyone, right? So they have to accept the fact that they're going to be suing people who don't deserve to be sued. They're going to be holding people accountable in cases when they shouldn't have been. Panel, this is the vast majority of cases in this debate. That is the burden side proposition have to defend. That is what they do not defend. At their best case, they get maybe a few more people calling. We think that we can solve that in a multitude of other ways. We don't think that is enough for them to win this debate. At the point at which we're infringing upon the rights of the vast majority of people, we think this is unjust. Let's then quickly understand why we think the extra action in most cases is going to be bad. We told you, the fact that you don't know the exact threshold of how much you need to intervene means it's going to be easier for you to tell yourself, okay, I'm going to try and do the Heimlich just so that I don't get sued. And maybe you probably are going to make the situation worse if you don't know how to do it correctly, but you're not going to be sued on that. You think you might be sued if you didn't do everything else. On our side, the people who would have helped others, in fact, the people who would have come out of their shock and called the police a few minutes afterwards aren't going to do that because they are afraid of being sued. They are afraid of being held accountable. We think that at the end of the day, we show you why it's unjust to do this and why the extra action is going to lead to more harm than good. For all of these reasons, oppose.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech. Is the panel ready to move to the prop reply? That's a yes, that's a yes, that's a yes. And that's a yes. In which case, we're now ready to move to the proposition reply to close the case for their side and indeed the debate as a whole. Here.
Cool. Opposition's core problem is that they have way too much faith in humanity. They think that most of the time, when someone sees someone lying on the road, they enter a state of extreme panic where they can't do anything to possibly help. We think that most of the time, it's actually that people couldn't care less. It's that they have their own matters that they want to attend, and they're in a hurry to get to a meeting that's scheduled in the next 15 minutes. The fact that opposition seems okay with criminal liability in all of these other instances, except the instances where people are nervous or in shock, shows that the bulk of our cases are conceded, and we've won this debate. So 2 questions to ask. Firstly, does this constitute as a crime, and does the state have an obligation to impose it? And secondly, do we practically get people to help? So firstly, does this constitute as a crime, and does the state have an obligation to impose it like that? So we said that all negligence relies on your action causing a significant amount of harm that you could have reasonably foreseen. That's why drunk driving is negligence. We said that this fits that criteria, that when you don't intervene, you cause a significant amount of harm, letting someone drown, letting someone suffer a stroke, and that you could have reasonably foreseen that harm. How did they respond? They had 2 central attacks in our argument. The first is that they say that most of the time people are in shock, so it's not a reasonable expectation to expect them to intervene. We said that 1, in the majority of instances, there are cases where people are literally in a hurry and therefore don't help. And we think that at least both sides should hold those cases criminally responsible, and it seems like they're okay with that. But secondly, we said right from the beginning that shock is a mitigating factor. There's a reason why crimes of passion are given a different sentence to premeditated crimes. It's that, yes, it is a little bit fuzzy, but the judicial system is designed to sift through that fuzziness and to see, and to test irrationality and see how much someone's state of mind was actually impacted. So we can do that on our side. The second thing that they say is just they give an example of how we don't hold people criminally liable when they don't give their wealth to charity. We said 2 core things. Firstly, we do actually have tax, where you're criminally responsible if you don't have tax. So again, right from the beginning, we said that we won't expect someone to do something that violates their rights. So we don't take all of someone's wealth, but we take a significant amount of their wealth because it does actually help other people. We think that that's fine. But secondly, this didn't actually attack our analysis. We said, as well in the beginning, that if they can prove that this tax example is sufficiently similar, and like it was sufficiently similar, then we could principally support it. They haven't actually attacked our logic. They've only tried to refute it with an example. But ultimately, we said the state has an obligation to impose this as criminal liability, that it proved that they have an obligation to create mass societal benefits. That's why you have to report a crime. That's why you have to pay tax. If this creates benefits, then we think the state has an obligation to do it. No real response. So second question, do we practically get people to help? So we said two things. Firstly, that people will now face a criminal penalty, that their freedoms could be stripped from them. We think that people don't want to go to prison. So in many cases, whereas someone would have walked over someone on the road and gone to their meeting, happens a lot of the time, they'll actually pay attention and they'll actually help people. We got no real response to this. And secondly, we said that there's no bystander effect, that at least now you won't think that other people will do it because the responsibility is on you. The only direct response we got to this, like outside of the third speech, was their own argument about how often people will create harm because they're nervous. We think that we gave two responses to this that ultimately made this fall out. So firstly, we said that it's unlikely. Our case is a reasonable expectation. We don't think people are that nervous about calling the ambulance. The reason they don't call the ambulance is that they don't want to get involved. They don't want to have to spend time being there and doing it. Most of the time, people aren't going to be crippled with nervousness. But secondly, we said that some intervention is almost always better than none. That when you see someone drowning, you can save them, that you can call 911. The only example is really the Heimlich maneuver, but we think people are more likely to just call for help in that situation. They're not actually more likely to let their nervousness perform a medical thing that they're not qualified to do. Lastly, they didn't attack our second speaker argument about how we change collective values. The law reflects morality. This is massively immoral. Therefore, the law must change that, and they haven't responded. I'm very proud to propose.
Cool. I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech, and indeed everyone for what was a really interesting debate. At this point, the judges will move to deliberation. If Sergio from Orcom could do this, that would be great.
Yes, actually, so because of the technical difficulty, what we're gonna do is we're gonna have the audience leave. If the audience can please leave the breakout room, we're gonna leave the judges here, and we're gonna have the audience. We're gonna do the deliberation and feedback in another Zoom call that we'll set up now. But we'll have judges do the deliberation here, so you can spend the majority of this.
Year after year, the World Schools Debating Championship gathers the best debaters from around the globe. This year's pandemic made that impossible, so we took it online. In this style of debate, there are two teams. The proposition team, which is in favor of the motion, and the opposition team, which is against it. Each side features 3 speakers giving 4 speeches. The first 2 speakers generally present constructive argumentation. The third primarily focuses on refutation, while the reply speaker summarizes the debate. For the prepared rounds, teams research the motions for weeks in advance. For the impromptu rounds, teams have only 1 hour to prepare after being told the motion.